So, welcome to this evening's Royal Historical Society lecture. It's lovely to see everybody, new faces and old faces. So, my name's Lucy Noakes. I'm president of the Royal Historical Society, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to the next in this year's series of Royal Historical Society public lectures and to the start of our autumn season events hosted by the Society. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the evening. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Yasmin Khan as our speaker. You can clap if you like. Thank you. So Yasmin is Professor of Modern History at the University of Oxford, where she teaches Global and Imperial History. Yasmin was born in London, educated at Oxford, and has taught at the universities of Edinburgh and London. And she'll be known to many of you here tonight through her publications and her media work. Yasmin's books include The Great Partition, The Making of India and Pakistan, that was published by Yale University Press in 2007, and The Rajat War, published by Bodley Head in 2015. And her broadcasting credits include the 2018 television series A Passage to Britain for BBC Two. Yasmin's been longlisted for many prizes, including the Orwell Prize, the Authors Club of Great Britain First Novel Prize, which I'm going to ask you about later, the Penn Hessel Tiltman Prize, and has won the Royal Historical Society's own Gladstone Prize for History and a Royal Television Society Award. And since 2012, Yasmin has worked with part-time students at Oxford and has a particular interest in working with lifelong learners. And she's also an editor of History Workshop Journal. So this evening, Yasmin will be discussing her current research on the centrality of non-European people for the exercise of British military power in the period of empire. Yasmin's lecture will highlight how extensively British military history has relied on non-British people in locations including North Africa, the Pacific, and East Asia over the past 2 centuries. Because understanding the complexities of this power and history has the potential to make us rethink and question well-established narratives of nation and empire. So please now join me again in welcoming Yasmin to give her lecture, Mars and Britannia, the British Imperial Way of Warfare.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here among old friends and new. And thank you to the President and the Council of the Royal Historical Society for the invitation, and in particular Philip Carter for making all these organisations and arrangements that it takes to put on an event like this. This year has marked the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. I suspect I don't need to tell anyone in this room that fact. The role of commemoration of Black and Asian soldiers has also become far more common and well integrated into the histories of both the First and Second World Wars in recent years. From public broadcasting to the establishment of memorials, the fact that the Indian Army played a major role in the First and Second World Wars has become much harder to miss. This is a good thing. It's crucial, I think, for children in our schools to know the global contribution to fighting the world wars, to demystify the idea of an island nation standing alone, and to more faithfully convey the complexities of the 20th century. Your RHS president, Lucy Noakes, and I, among a committee of other historians, played a small part in this by advising and informing the content of the new Second World War galleries opened at the Imperial War Museum in 2021. And this poster, the Together poster, is one of the items now on permanent display there in those galleries. This image starkly depicts how Britain promoted the war in the 1940s as an imperial affair, drawing on global assistance. But it also explicitly reveals the racial hierarchies and priorities so clearly embedded in both policy and outlook at the time. And new historical work on participation in those wars has nuanced these stories, particularly developing questions around agency, sources, and voice. How and where can we hear about wartime participation and representation of these individuals? How can we fill in the missing gaps? Non-European peoples enabled British warfare in numerous respects. Thousands of Black and Asian soldiers were on the front line and died fighting. But they also provided food, dug trenches, carried supplies with mules, and scouted out the enemy from rivers and treetops. They taught British military officers about local terrain and hazards. They delivered food, carried heavy packs over mountains and high passes. They translated, spied, carried out dangerous acts of espionage. They washed uniforms and mended boots. They buried bodies and saved lives. In 2021, the Secretary of State for Defence apologised on behalf of the government and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Francis knows about this because his doctorate is about it. The gaps in our knowledge were illustrated vividly by an investigation and a report that year commissioned by the War Graves Commission that had concluded that at least 116,000, perhaps as many as 350,000, mostly African and Middle Eastern casualties from the First World War, and I quote, were not commemorated by name or possibly not commemorated at all. This was despite the historic and celebrated remit of the organisation to treat all British and Commonwealth deaths equally. The causes cited were quoted as entrenched prejudices, preconceptions, and the pervasive racism of contemporary imperial attitudes. Many figures and casualty lists appear to have been flawed. The majority of those whose names weren't recorded were carriers and non-combatants in Africa and the Middle East. In short, there's still vast gaps in our knowledge in the recovery of individual participation in these wars, and understandably, a hunger among some descendants for commemoration. However, tonight, I'm going to take a different angle. I would respectfully suggest this evening that the inclusion and recovery of non-European participation in European wars is only a very early stepping stone in remaking historiographies of British warfare and in decolonising war history more thoroughly. As the political scientist Tariq Bakawi points out, the model of the sovereign nation state is a poor guide in any era to the organisation of military power in world politics. So in this lecture, I'm going to go beyond the First and Second World Wars, or step back further in time to the 19th century and try and think more structurally about the ways in which our military histories have excluded non-European peoples. Although adding black and brown people to the record is undoubtedly an important step, especially in the current political climate in Britain, it only takes us so far, making this multicultural twist to establish narratives. A more thorough critique and analysis of Europe's war-making requires a different optic and a longer durée. Despite the Victorian projection of Pax Britannica and the narrative of peace, nearly every year from 1857 to 2021, Britain was engaged somewhere in the world in conflict. In South Africa, in Afghanistan, in Malaya, in the Middle East. And even today, Britain's military has a permanent presence at 145 base sites in 42 countries. The connection between armed forces and local civilians, such as contractors, gardeners, translators, tailors, shopkeepers, and caterers, and we've heard about those coming from Afghanistan, it's a very old and long connection, fundamental to the growth of the British Empire. Lascars on board ships moved food and essential supplies, dodging torpedoes and storms. Most campaigns in the 19th and 20th centuries relied on foreign soldiers, from Gurkhas to fighters of the Maori battalion. And this transcends years of formal empire and decolonisation, and it covers territories where formal imperial control was never even established. Indeed, one limitation is that it's just not possible to cover all the conflicts in which Britain was involved since 1857. There's over 100. Yet despite this, our understanding of Britain's role in wars often appears bounded by the nation state. This isn't only a British phenomenon, and similar stories could be told for the French, Dutch, and other European empires, but my focus this evening is on the British Empire, where I think the scale of this was greatest. We can critique military historians for Eurocentricity, and that's not uncommon. But modern social and cultural historians have often conceded this space. Some exceptions I would name working on war include David Anderson, Kim Wagner, Priya Satya, Gajendra Singh, and Shantanu Das. But often we've been squeamish about military history, as if the object of our study might reflect on our own political commitments. The new imperial historiographies, now not so new after all, have tended to steer away from military subjects, even though violence and everyday violence have become lately more clearly identified as proper subjects for investigation in the work of people like Elizabeth Kolsky and Taylor Sherman. Specific focus just on military campaigns still risks a whiff of Boy's Own magazine, as if the risk of contamination by Victorian imperialist ideology was ever present. However, the Victorians were exceptional record keepers, and the military documents are an immensely rich and detailed source if we bring a critical lens to them and read, as the injunction goes, against the grain. So I'm going to argue that British imperialism depended absolutely on non-European soldiery and non-European peoples, that the whole system was intrinsically linked to the deployment of this manpower, not only as soldiers, but also as lascars, merchant seamen, non-combatants, and couldn't have been existed without the manipulation and coercion of this power. So to write military histories of Britain without this imperial scaffolding is increasingly untenable. I'm going to discuss 5 mainly 19th century examples, each very briefly, you'll be relieved to know, as snapshots of how this might be further explored before drawing to some conclusions at the end of this lecture. So, I'm going to start in 1868. I'd like to take us to Abyssinia in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, where in 1868 Britain sent a vast force. In the Abyssinian campaign, 13,000 soldiers and 26,000 non-combatants were sailed to the coast of the Horn of Africa and trekked over 800 miles into the highlands of the country to fight the local ruler. Most of these men were Indian, and this expensive, ferociously ambitious, logistically challenging mission was all directed not from London, but from India. One of the distinguishing features of military power is the command economy and the ability to move stuff over great distances. As the American aphorism goes, infantry wins battles, logistics wins wars. This was very much on display during the Abyssinian campaign of 1868. This was basically a hostage situation. 8 British missionary hostages who'd been captured some years earlier were rescued through the defeat and death of the Christian king Tewodros. The Abyssinian campaign was a classic example of what Lauren Benton has described as a protection emergency, a discrete episode where it's argued at the time military power simply has to be deployed in a display of force in the face of uncivilized peoples to both avenge and to demonstrate power. The town of Magdala, where King Tewodros had retreated and was encircled, was brought under British control. The king committed suicide, and his small son, just 7 years old, was taken by the British back to England to present to Queen Victoria. The prince died 10 years later. In recent years, you may have heard of this because the campaign has sometimes been covered in the British press because of the retention of loot from this in British museums and institutions not far from here, as well as the remains of the child himself, still interred in Windsor Castle to this day. However, my interest in this episode is different and turns on the outside scale of the incursion, which was fantastically ambitious and expensive, quite out of proportion to the crisis, and the role of the Indian Army in particular. The entire campaign was handed over to General Napier, and that's the cousin of the other Napier who conquered Sind with his Latin quip. This Napier was well known for his role in the conquest of Punjab and crushing the uprising of 1857. And he ran this punitive expedition from Bombay. So this was nearly in all senses an Indian campaign organised and supplied from India, one colony's resources being used against a different continent. A striking dimension was the rapid and extensive mobilization of Indian resources, which were shipped out from Bombay and Calcutta to East Africa. As my colleague Richard Reed notes in The African Revolution, British campaigns in Africa relied almost entirely on local manpower. In only a handful of cases were substantial bodies of European soldiers deployed on African soil. This expedition, this punitive expedition, took 3 months, and it was a technological and logistical feat. Napier brought an artificial harbour, as well as lighthouses and a mobile railway system, as well as camels, horses, mules, and 44 elephants from India, some of which you can see in this etching. Indian soldiers were paid by the Indian government, as usual, but London footed the bill for food, fodder, equipment, and extra allowances. And the scale of this effort was dramatically shown by a scramble to acquire thousands of mules, camels, and other animals, all boarded at India and shipped across to East Africa, and the commandeering of vast quantities of goods. 291 ships from 5 Indian ports took saddles, candles, paint, tools, tables, flour, rice, wheat, tea, but also thousands of non-combatants, carpenters, smiths, armourers, grass cutters. Water and coal were snapped up at Aden, and the Mediterranean was scoured for more animals and mules, including ships sent to Gibraltar, Galicia, and Alicante. This mobilization had social and economic effects across the region. In some ways, it foreshadowed the wartime command economies of the next century. But it wasn't only South Asians being employed in Abyssinia. As in all wars, labour relations with local people were crucial, as they were induced or forced to work for the incoming military power. Shoho people, Eritrean cattle herders, were made to work ferrying and portering, landing stores, stacking hay. Some struck work and demanded water and better pay. This labour was of the utmost importance, I quote, according to the official report compiled afterwards. And by dint of persevering and kindly driving, work was got out of them. Labour organising their bargaining power is often visible in the military records such as this, and in this case, a negotiation of some conditions. We can also see in this series of violent events all manner of other brutalisation and peculiarities occasioned by war. After the defeat of Magdala, Tristram Speedy, pictured here, was given responsibility for the king's son and travelled with him, as I mentioned, to show him to Queen Victoria like a sort of war trophy, but then took him onwards to India, where Speedy became Superintendent of Police in Oudh. The letters of Tristram Speedy, appointed to the personal staff of Napier as an Amharic interpreter, lay bare the reliance on intermediaries and translators, the dependence on Indian troops and on local peoples, but also, noticeably, his determination to claim this as an English event, even as he describes in detail the wounding of Sikh soldiers by spears and the role of Indian soldiers, he pronounces European discipline and European arms won the day. Speedy describes in detail his own personal looting of this shield from an Abyssinian warrior. Well, a shield, but perhaps the one pictured here. But he also nationalises the military victory of destroying Magdala, writing gleefully with the rhetorical question in a letter, "What will they say in England?" A close reading of the Abyssinian campaign, then, I think, sort of reveals several features of interest. One of these is the clear centrality of India's army to the making of British Empire. Just as India was a reservoir for indentured labour on plantations, it also provided migrant military labour, readily deployable along land and sea routes. But this show of might and exercise of sovereign power was a double-sided coin, intended to achieve a short-term goal, but also to awe and subdue others into submission. And ironically, this was closely entangled with some high points of nationalistic fervour in Britain, where imperial actions were claimed as national victories. This brings me to my second example, and we sail now across the Mediterranean to Malta and then onwards to Cyprus a decade later. The first Indian deployment to Europe came just 10 years later in 1878, when Britain sent troops to Malta and then onwards to Cyprus during the Russo-Turkish crisis. This, again, wasn't a war per se, but it was a moment of high militarism and patriotic fervour. There was heightened jingoism in Britain as war with Russia seemed likely. As one correspondent reported in 1878, the music halls in London had a popular song going round. "We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too." Once again, this was feted as a logistical feat. To give you a sense of the scale, the Malta Expeditionary Force included over 5,500 Indian soldiers, thousands of camp followers, horses, ponies, bullocks. Only a few hundred European officers were present. In Malta, the presence of the Indian soldiers was both a real and strategic benefit. The South Asian men were inspected by senior royals, including the Prince of Wales and Duke of Cambridge. And I think this is probably the first time Asians arrived in Europe collectively in such numbers. British readers were presented with ethnographic typologies, not of just so-called martial races, Sikhs, Gurkhas, Pathans, which you can see in this picture, but also of camp followers such as this water carrier. You can see at the top there in the middle. In 1878, these troops were sent onwards to Cyprus in preparation for the British occupation of that island. They included Madras sappers and miners who went in an advance party and carried out construction and military building as well as roadworks as Britain took the colony from the Ottomans. And here they are looking remarkably interchangeable with other forms of manual labour. This role in sort of logistics and infrastructure is something that I'll keep coming back to. The use of Indian troops was watched carefully from Britain and not without some apprehension and debate. This wasn't about the trust deficit, as it's been described after the 1857 uprising, and a fear of renewed rebellion, but actual consternation about the idea of Britain using South Asian troops too extensively for war-making itself. There was undoubted curiosity and interest in the visual appearance of the soldiers and their uniforms. Giuseppe Carli, a Maltese artist, painted this portrait of a native officer of the 13th Bengal Lancers, a series of romantic and lively paintings of Indian soldiers, which contrast quite noticeably with the stiffer ethnographic etchings in the British press. But this moment also sparked constitutional debate back in London. Members of Parliament questioned whether it was lawful or even ethical to deploy Indian troops for European defence. Concerns were raised that the Crown was assembling a shadow army outside of parliamentary control. Some in Parliament spoke out against the use of troops being unconstitutional, as it went against earlier acts of Parliament which set the size of Britain's standing army, arguing that Indian involvement contravened restrictions on the use of Indian revenues for the defence of India, and went beyond the remit with which Indian troops were bound. The year before the Malta Dispatch, there had been similar questions raised about the sending of Sikhs to New Zealand. It appeared that little by little, the Crown was getting at its disposal a much larger force than was voted for by Parliament. And it was highly important that the relations in which we stood to the Indian Army should in this respect be clearly established and understood. The precise number of men which the army was to consist of was annually voted by the House, but if they permitted the employment without remark of Indian troops out of India, although there might appear reasons for it, the result would be to place at the disposal of the Crown an army of 100,000 or 200,000 men beyond the force directly sanctioned by the House. So for context, the British Army was about 200,000 people at this point. So the question was hinging on the right of the British government to send Indian troops into a context where the defence of India itself was no way clear. After 1858, the Government of India Act said that troops were only to be used abroad, Indian troops were only to be used abroad, if this was in the interest of South Asian safety and security. But this is a really grey area. To what extent does involvement in the Middle East, or Egypt, or North Africa, or the Mediterranean suggest an Indian interest, or a British interest? Where do the boundaries of war-making lie? In the end, the Indophiles won out, or perhaps the possibilities of this manpower were just too irresistible. Our native auxiliaries, at times of India peace, stated boldly in a headline that year, are better than French and Germans. The feeling is that we are showing the sample of a resource which was not generally thought to be available. If 10,000 men can be brought to Europe, it will be easy enough to bring 100,000, continued the Times of India correspondent. Our native auxiliaries, such of them as are here, are far and away beyond the French in physique, equal to the Germans, and drill above both in cleanliness and candour. And the Indians drink less and give less trouble than British soldiers. So this was immensely convenient at a time when German and French standing armies were growing rapidly, with Germany and France both having introduced conscription in 1871. Britain dodged these debates on conscription, even while they happened in Europe, and maintained a much smaller standing army, only turning to conscription for the first time in 1916. As Tariq Bokawi puts it, the British were able to maintain a very modestly sized national army while bringing and keeping a large part of the planet under their control. And the costs were gradually passed to the Indian peasant, cultivator, and taxpayer. As South Asian historians know, this created a self-serving fiscal logic whereby Britain could wage war globally while keeping domestic defence spending low. India, because of its population and the length of contact time with Britain, as well as the pre-existence of early modern Mughal gunpowder armies, was the great supplier of military labour. Yet it wasn't only South Asians who were being deployed in this way, and many other populations were touched by Britain's wars. So my next case takes us to Egypt and Sudan in 1884. We go forward in time 6 years to 1884, and to a very different group of military labourers brought to Africa by the British, not from the East, but from North America. In September 1884, 386 men boarded ships in Quebec, bound for Egypt and Sudan. This group of men were dubbed the Nile Voyager. These were the first ever men recruited by Britain from Canada for Imperial Overseas Service, and they included nearly 100 First Nations people, including, pictured here, James Deere. Securing Sudan was not just a discrete geographical project, it was part of an imperial strategy to control the length of the Nile from delta to headwaters, linking the East African coast to British India and Egypt. In 1884, 386 men from Ontario, Manitoba and Quebec were contracted for 6 months and shipped across to Egypt and employed to navigate whale boats on the Nile to ferry thousands of soldiers closer to Khartoum as part of the desperate attempt to save General Gordon, who was under siege. This plan seems frankly bonkers. At first sight, it even looks like simple propaganda, that the might of the British Empire could employ all races and creeds and deploy them at will. And that might have been part of it. But it wasn't just a publicity stunt. Indeed, the story of the Canadians was distinctly muted in the London press. General Wolseley, charged with defeating the Mahdi's rebellion in Sudan and trying to save General Gordon, who was being held captive in Khartoum at the time, reckoned that navigating the Nile held the best possible chance of arrival and success. And he'd used rivers for military purposes in Canada, and he retained memories of the Iroquois boatmen's skills. And he demanded that these Indians were brought, and the Canadian Indians were brought, and personally took care to emphasize that point. These men, mostly who'd worked in the lumber industry, spent 6 months moving boats up the Nile. Now, the historiography about this small but significant episode is very limited and barely registers at all in histories of the Mahdi rebellion. I'm indebted to Canadian scholars, in particular Carl Benn and Anthony Michel, in which some of this narrative is drawn. James Deere, pictured here, was 18 at the time. He was born at Akwesasne, where he lived most of his life, and he'd been baptized at a Mohawk reserve in Ontario. And he acted both as a boatman and as an interpreter for the Iroquois who couldn't speak English. And he later published a short book of memoirs about it. This extraordinary episode reveals several layers of British military history. At first, this could be seen, as I said, as like a propaganda stunt. David Lambert denotes some of the earlier struggles over perceptions of the black soldier in the West African regiments as wars of representation. In that struggle, in that case, the struggle was over representing black men as worthy soldiers in the age of abolition. But in the case of the Canadians, the stakes were very different. There were struggles over approval and inclusion. The news of the recruitment was greeted with excitement in Canada, but it was also beset with racial overtones. Were they suitable recruits? Who would be seen worthy as representing Canada as a whole? And imagery vacillating between idealized notions of the noble savage to scraps over the class, linguistic, and employment backgrounds of the men. So there's lots of different avenues and interesting questions we could explore in relation to this episode. Another is the men's indeterminate status as neither quite soldiers nor simply civilian employees, and that's another question which I'll return to. But the aspect which intrigues me is the sheer skill of these men and their unique power honed by generations of work shifting timber on Canadian rivers. This seems to have made them both the object of admiration and envy. One British general said privately that he thought he might get as good men on Portsmouth Beach, and boatmen on the Thames were reported to have been offended at being passed over. Yet the absolute skills that these men possessed were hard for anyone to deny. Although reductionist and Orientalist readings of Indigenous people can easily ally them with their habitats or environments, there's also undoubtedly Indigenous knowledge which could be drawn upon by the British military in imperial contexts, and this is an example. This wasn't innate or unchanging. Of course, many of the other voyagers of European or Métis origin shared this knowledge of how to navigate and handle these boats. The men worked in incredibly challenging and unsafe conditions to come over the very dangerous rocky white rapids in the Nile. This gave them a certain bargaining power, perhaps. Deere's memoir is marked with a poignancy of fear. Stories of friends who die swept away in the currents, and 16 of them died on this mission. Deere writes how they threw some oars, a lifebelt and a rope, none of which could reach, as the whirlpool caught him again and he sank once more. But when he came up the last time, an oar was thrown to him, and he caught it by the blade, but disappeared. We never saw him again, and thus another of our Indian friends was taken from us. So although requested to re-enlist at the end of their 6-month contract, the majority of the group refused. Deere also describes an officer who wanted 8 of us Indians to go with him, but none of the party would agree. Palpable frustration of Deere's short, superficially upbeat account of his journey to North Africa can be read for undercurrents of resistance and also disappointment. But what comes across clearly is the jeopardy and hazard In one discrete episode, Dear appears to point the finger at a British officer who tried to steer the boat and took the tiller from a Canadian Indian, who then being, and this is a quote, being so angry was probably careless and fell in the water to his death. I think this episode points us to the fact that although chains of command seem to suggest that we should look for power at the top of a pyramid in wartime, small acts, supporting roles, and local moments of resistance are vital in understanding the everyday negotiations which accompany any military campaign, but also the quiet limitations of British power and the reliance on local knowledge and skills. Doesn't want to move now. There we go. My next example turns away from land and towards the sea and to the Lashkars. Lascars, I'm sure many of you know, but it's a fluid term which is used to describe sailors from the Indian Ocean region employed on European vessels. And the word Lascar is derived from the Persian lashkar, meaning army or camp. It entered European usage via Portuguese and eventually became a generic term used by the British to describe non-European seamen. So Lascars weren't a single ethnic group, they were drawn from a very wide geographical arc, Bengal, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, but also Oman, Somalia, Zanzibar, and even as far as China and the Malay Islands. What united them was their shared experience of maritime labour under imperial regimes. The employment of Lascars dates back to the 16th century, when the Portuguese began hiring Indian sailors. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the British East India Company was increasingly dependent on them, particularly for ships returning to Britain. Many British sailors deserted or died in India, creating a labour gap that Lascars filled. Their numbers expanded rapidly during the Napoleonic Wars. In just a decade, the number of Lascars employed on British ships increased sixfold. By the 19th century, with the advent of steam-powered liners and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, Lascar labour became even more vital. European sailors were often reluctant to work in the very hot, claustrophobic engine rooms, and Lascars were recruited in colonial port cities, placed in the most gruelling jobs on board as coal trimmers in the boiler rooms, deckhands, firemen, cooks, and stewards. These roles were physically punishing, often in temperatures over 50 degrees Celsius. A 1910 parliamentary report on Lascar conditions starkly illustrates the racial hierarchy aboard ships. Lascars received a fraction of white sailors' wages, were housed in cramped quarters below deck, their food was of a lower quality, medical care was minimal, and they were denied access to unions. Permission for the employment of Asian Lascars on the North Atlantic route was officially granted by the British Admiralty during World War I in 1917, when manpower shortages created a need, particularly in merchant shipping, vital at that time. At the start of the Second World War, by 1938, just over a quarter of merchant seamen on British vessels were South Asian. And they still ate a cheaper diet, suffered more ill health, had poorer clothing allowances. Basically, Victorian practices were carried on right up into modern times. Historians have extensively debated their mobility, their agency and freedom to utilise their travels to secure more rights. Despite their extensive mobility, Lascars were systematically excluded from higher paying positions and routes, and segmentation was inherent in the maritime labour market. Many could not leave ships freely at British ports under their contracts, were confined to ships, or were prevented from settling in more prosperous regions. Yet Lascars also leveraged their occupations to smuggle, to trade, to migrate, and became involved in politics, running lively underground networks around the world. Nye Bevan, the British Labour politician, described them as cheap human fodder, and British and Asian labour activists took up their cause in a series of strikes and protests in the interwar years, but particularly in the Second World War. Now, those of you who work on sort of modern South Asia might know quite a lot of this. And the point I would emphasise about Lascars this evening, in addition to pointing out the sheer scale of their role in naval history, is just how rich the historiography is and continues to become, both in volume and scope, in contrast to other imperial military subjects. The historiographies of Lascars in the work of scholars such as Ravi Ahuja, Arun Jaffa, Gopal Balachandran, have suggested, they've stressed subjectivity, resistance, agency, justice, inequality, gender, family relationships. These are subjects very familiar to the repertoire of social historians. So my sort of query is, why have those at sea attracted this interest when this has generally not been the case for others on land? Partly, this is because Lascar history is more closely connected to the metropole in the trajectories of migration and settlement. So you have communities like the Chinese in Liverpool, the Yemeni in Cardiff, or Bangladeshis in East London. Community and local historians, starting with Rosina Visram's seminal work in the 1980s, have drawn the dots between Lascars of the past and 20th century migration. But also, Lascars themselves, because of their close connection with protests, strikes, mutiny, and resistance, have perhaps been perceived as worthy subjects of social and subaltern histories. Their leaders had close links with socialist and communist parties, and seafarers also naturally transcend the boundaries of nation states. They become part of the story of cosmopolitanism and of port cities. However, I would argue that denationalizing and decolonizing other military workforces might also involve some of the same paradigms and approaches. Other kinds of auxiliaries, or non-combatants, people caught up in war, can be imagined similarly as laborers, as subjects of mobility and migration. And this brings me to my last and final point of emphasis, which is on the non-combatants who've already regularly cropped up in this lecture. So what do I mean by non-combatant? Well, here the terminology becomes really interesting. There were regimental followers, which often included women and children, but also various words and terminology were used by contemporaries. Coolies, labourers, sutlers, camp followers. So this has the effect of blurring who we're actually talking about, their roles, their status, and perhaps this blurring was advantageous to the senior officers. Some were doing menial tasks from cleaning to washing and carrying. Others were engaged in work closer to construction and skilled labour. Radhika Singh, in her important work on the First World War, stresses the grey zone between non-combatants and combatants in India in the First World War. How many followers came from the same area as formal recruits, and the extent of service of same families over generations. How the daily life of the bazaar and the cantonment came into contact. Attached followers were more formally assigned to regiments or other formations and included cooks, sweepers, water carriers. There were also coolie corps for road building and porterage. But alongside them lived and worked private followers, barbers, servants, dobies, washermen, often funded through mess funds, subscriptions, or even deductions from officer wages. So in the empire, even rank and file soldiers, British soldiers, had servants. Another aspect to this was wider economic infrastructure, supply lines and goods which fueled war, tea, uniforms, coal. I've written a bit about that about the Second World War, the porousness between plantation workers, say, and road building for the military, as well as the darker side of this in the increase of sex work which accompanies all military concentrations. Urvi Ketan has developed this in her excellent work on gendered labour, for example, in the coal mines of northeast India in the Second World War. Of course, part of the problem with trying to recover the histories of any of these individuals is the gross discrepancy between the ability of first-person sources and individual memories, say, of British officers and subaltern non-combatants. This is even the case well into the 20th century. The records are still patchy, still scarce, but there may be more present than we imagine in military records. And I'll end this lecture with a description of one individual who I found in the Malaysian National Archives, who transcends camp following, soldiering, and sea crossing in his own lifetime. Yasmin Khan was born in Kabul sometime in the mid-19th century. He describes himself as a northern Indian born in Kabul. A Muslim, he appears to have made his way down to the Punjab plains for employment. At least this is where he was recruited in 1874 by somebody we've already encountered, Captain Speedy. Tristram Speedy, maverick soldier and all-round hard man for empire, had already fought in 1857 in New Zealand and, as we've seen, in Abyssinia. He was in India in 1874 with a very specific and private mission to round up suitable men, to recruit them on behalf of a Malay kingdom, and to take them back there to fight on behalf of the Malay leader there in the so-called La Route Wars. And he was being paid very handsomely for the task. He was being paid about £35,000. What did men like Yasmin Khan themselves know about this employment or what it would involve? It seems there was general confusion in Punjab about what they were being recruited for. Local police reports agreed that the men who were being recruited by Speedy were unsure of where they were being sent. Many were under the misapprehension that they were being sent to the Andaman Islands as guards. Some deserted on the way to Calcutta before boarding ship. About half of the men recruited sailed. The 200 men Speedy picked up in 2 days were Pathans and hill tribesmen and villagers, possibly former sepoys from earlier actions. And the local magistrate concurred. There are numbers of men willing enough to go beyond the sea with good prospect of pay. These men were tough, he said. They were fit for soldiers rather than just policemen only. The reason they chose to go along with Speedy then was the wages being offered. And Speedy himself said he wanted a fighting sort of man, not from towns where he refused to recruit, but from the villages. Interestingly, his actions actually pushed the government into controlling enlistment more tightly afterwards. We know that Yasmin Khan stuck it out, went across the ocean on a ship and made it to Malaya, where he spent at least the next 37 years of his life. Yasmin Khan, unusually for a man without rank or status, appears in historical files because of a later pension claim and recommendations for a medal. And so we can get an impression of his usefulness in this emergent force, an unregulated, non-governmental, essentially private army, which morphed over time into the Perak Armed Police, the forerunner of the Malaysian police force. We can see through these documents his checkered career and a reference towards his pension. And the reference says, "It's impossible to overestimate the value this man has been to the state. In the early days, he did everything from drilling the gunners and repairing arms to hair cutting, butcher, and milk supplier. There is nothing he cannot do, and he does everything well." He earned a pension in 1890, but Yasmin Khan wrote himself that his pension he unfortunately commuted as he thought he would be able to trade, but times being bad, your petitioner, that's him, found he could not earn sufficient by his trade to get himself re-employed. And then he was retained as an assistant armourer. In other words, he sort of wanted to get out of military service. He'd seen an opportunity to use his position in Malaya to trade. He cashed in his pension to do that, but then he'd found he was in financial straits and he needed employment back with the British forces. This picture shows Speedy, he's the tall guy in the middle, with some of the men he recruited and took with him. And although it's impossible to know, I like to think that there's a strong likelihood that Yasmin Khan is one of the men in this picture. But I think what we can see from this example is some of that porousness between combatant, non-combatant, the mobility of these men and the circular work that they're doing, but also their crucial reliance on the state, on some of these individuals. So I will finally draw to some conclusions for the last few minutes of this lecture. I think it's hard to deny the profound Eurocentricity of many accounts of modern wars. In military history, this is meshed with the class optics, so writers have tended towards looking at generals and commanders and the men who gave orders, those who wrote accessible letters and memoirs who are on plinths in our streets. And this has worked to obscure the histories of the most junior and marginalised, women, non-combatants, merchant seamen, those in petty and auxiliary roles of all races. This entwining together of class and race has created this occlusion. Why is this important, and why is this an important gap in our accounts of the British Empire? Well, firstly, because there was just so much fighting going on. Many of these small wars have been forgotten. The sheer extent is breathtaking. For many people across the world, warfare was their experience of the empire. Secondly, the ways in which we think about modern war are so often framed in national and nationalist terms. Too often, British wars turn out to have been possible only because of local supply lines, camp followers, migrant labour, or logistical support. Often this was cheap and services were provided at a lower cost and through coercion. We need to fundamentally rethink the idea of the British Army as just a national force. The idea that Britain conquered the world with British soldiers is frankly a myth. These are classic imperial patterns, drawing on imperial hegemony and local participation and coercion, as well as straightforward subjugation and violence. But rulers also inserted themselves pivotally into political systems to extract and leverage manpower. This isn't to ignore, but to complicate the place of race in the history of imperialism. Thirdly, we can revisit how military labour was produced and sustained. Just as many have written about, India was a reservoir for indentured labour and plantations, but it also provided this migrant military labour. If we consider soldiers as the subjects of labour history, then we can see them quite differently. And once we go beyond the idea of the soldiers depicted in the Second World War poster that I showed you at the beginning of this lecture, the centrality of camp followers and non-combatants starts to come into view. And finally, as I've tried to show this evening, wars cannot be safely cordoned from one part of the world from another. The entanglement of local, national, and international security is a hallmark of empire. So as much as the Victorians promoted the idea of small wars and Pax Britannica, one conflict in one part of the empire had unintended effects on another part. Wars affect all parts of society. They shape economies, they reverberate through local, national, and international spaces. I will end by saying that the scope for revisionist histories of British military expeditions is considerable. Returning to my point about commemoration at the start, I think historians have lots to do here to recover the voice of individuals, but also to decolonise war histories more systemically. Hearing the voices of those caught up in wars is one way of doing this, but as I've tried to show in this lecture, that's only one aspect, and the structural changes, economic, social, political, and cultural, could find more prominence in our imperial histories. The experience of being caught up in a war can, and I would argue should, be written as a more equal, democratic, and ultimately a more universal story. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, for a really just fascinating, wide-ranging and complex history that you've outlined for us there. We have got about 10-15 minutes for questions. So, questions from the floor, please. And I'll pass the microphone around. Yes.
Yes, I mean, thank you.
So, can you wait for the mic? We've got people listening in online. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that panoramic sort of view of such a wide geographical area and over such an amount of time. I guess just to add to the diversity, there are various, I suppose, kind of British-sponsored gendarmeries outside of the formal empire, the South Persia Rifles, Transjordan Frontier Force, the Arab Legion, and all the rest of them, just to add to that. I mean, to what extent do you think these are just a series of sticking plaster solutions or expedients versus you could present it as a bit like a Swiss Army knife? You've got various forces which are very tailored to particular kind of purposes.
I'm going to try and summarise the questions using this mic for people that are listening online. So the question is about the sort of small local, like yes, policing forces and their role in all of this. Yes. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, I do think they're sticking plasters. I think often, I mean, if you study imperialism, you know, I mean, it's an old Cambridge school thing. It goes back to the 1970s, that local people are pivotal in creating imperial systems, and that, I mean, anybody who works on the history of India, that's real baseline. And so I just think it's an extension of that in a way into the military sphere that hasn't always been really talked about or debated in the way that we might do, that there's a real reliance on local knowledge, economies, skills, which is kind of brushed over by the language. When you read history books, it often says British troops. or British and Imperial troops. Really common to see that in military history books. But actually something like Abyssinia, you know, 3/4, if not 4/5 of the people there are not white British. So it just creates, once you start to think of it in that chain, you realise just the social effects that must have on the places that they're taking soldiers from, or where they're recruiting from, or where they're taking resources from. So it's about sort of trying to expand it in that way. That's what I'm thinking. But all the things you mentioned, those 20th century forces, there's a huge list of things that I haven't even begun to talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Next question is over here, and I can see other hands going up as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I'm actually a historian of childhood and youth. My question is about age. Can you say anything? I mean, I was fascinated. James Deere, I think, was 18. Juma Khan, 37 years of service. Can you just say something about the age profile of both those who were soldiers and non-combatants? And also what happened if they became too old to serve? Was there any recognition? I actually work at the old Royal Naval College at Greenwich, so you know, looking after old soldiers was something that was quite prominent in, well, ostensibly in Britain.
Yeah. I'm just going to summarise that for people online.
Yes.
I'm sorry. So that question is about the age of the soldiers and the very different ages that you've talked about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And well, on the pension side, completely different structures for pensions in the Indian Army to British Army. There's a whole, I mean, the Gurkha, the whole kind of campaign around the Gurkhas in the 20th century has been about equalising some of those benefits, but pensions were very, very different, just to put it simply. But the age question, I mean, we know even in the First and Second World Wars that many, many teenagers, really young teenagers, 14, 15, were going from South Asia to First World War, to the front in Europe and in Second World War too, mainly because people didn't have birth certificates and wanted often to earn the money or to get away from home or to have an adventure. Having said that, my Irish grandmother also joined up younger than the official age because it was, she wanted to get away, you know, and do that, and swapped birth. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but anyway, there is sort of the whole history of birth certificates and people trading names and all that is quite sort of interesting. So I suspect, and I don't have the evidence for it, but I suspect in the 19th century you see exactly the same thing. But again, you know, in the East India Company, the writer, you know, there were young British boys going at 13, 14, weren't they, on ships? So it's, I think the whole age at which we peg military service is just so much younger in this whole period.
Thank you. Right, we've got quite a few hands going up. You were next, and I've got one over here.
Thank you very much for the talk. I thought it was wonderful. One thing that did occur to me, you mentioned, I'm trying to look at the date now, 1878, Sikhs being sent to Cyprus. It suddenly occurred to me, would the fact that if they were going to fight anybody in Cyprus, it would have been the Ottoman Empire, would that have any impact on them, any likelihood of make it more likely to send Sikhs? Because I got the impression that you wouldn't send non-white soldiers to fight white Europeans. But going to Cyprus, they're fighting the terrible Turk.
Yeah, no, I think, sorry.
Sorry,
I want to remember.
People online. So it's a question about the role of Sikh soldiers fighting the people from the Ottoman Empire in Cyprus, an issue of race and how that might shape that.
I mean, in this Cypriot case, they handed the island over effectively, so it wasn't. The likelihood of conflict was not. It wasn't that they were going into battle, but it was more of kind of occupying force. But you're right. There were always debates about how far. It's only in the First World War really that Indians are able to, or seen as able to fight white troops, and that's the first time that occurs. And even during that time, there's a lot of debate and discussion about whether that should be allowed, possible. So I think the choice of Cyprus and Malta in that respect. It's very much part of that Mediterranean world, isn't it? I mean, we can describe it as Europe, but it's on that cusp. So I think that's a good point.
Thank you. One over here.
Thank you for that fascinating lecture. Much has been written about the Second World War and its pivotal role in catalyzing nationalist movements, especially in Africa, and kind of leading to decolonization. What can be recovered from the archive in terms of voices and opinions and thoughts from the 19th century as your focus, in terms of that kind of cracking of imperial veneer and prestige, and do we find traces of non-Europeans' involvement in wars, especially transnationally, if there are examples of kind of kind of enlightening people against colonial power and imperial power.
So thank you. It's a question about the visibility or the hearability of the non-European voice in the 19th century colonial archive.
And also the sort of nascent nationalism, or at least a kind of critique of European power. I think it's there, and I would love to find more of it, or at least to find. I mean, I should say that this is the first stage in a kind of longer project, so, or at least an intermediate stage in a longer project. So I'm trying to find as many first-person accounts from non-combatants, particularly, but all kind of non-European soldiers as I can. And there are accounts. I mean, there's one of a soldier, an Indian soldier, who's at the Boxer rebellion in China, and that is suppressed, and Indian soldiers are there. And he talks about seeing European soldiers looting like animals. So there are these kind of observations that you could see, but how much you can draw from that, I don't know. But I think again, we know from, as you're saying, from the First and Second World Wars, that it has a very strong effect on kind of nationalizing impulse and on critiques of European states. So I think you could kind of imagine that you might find the same going into the 19th century. But I think it's the trouble is to find those first-person sources is going to be really tricky. Yeah.
I think we've got time for two more questions. I'll take this one, and then we've got one at the back, and then I think we have to wrap up. Thank you.
I just wanted to learn a bit more about how these soldiers were outside the ambit of Parliament, and were their salaries being paid by the British Indian government, or were they being paid by the British government in the UK? And secondly, do you think that this model can be replicated in the current era with more demands on defense spending and
Yeah.
Okay, so for people that are listening online, how were people paid fundamentally, through which processes, and can we do it again?
in the sense that it just seems to be a precursor to a lot of these private military companies that you have operating.
Sure.
Yeah.
So just to draw that parallel.
Is this a model that private military companies might?
Yeah. No, I think, I mean, we're laughing, but in a way, I think I'd like to extend the argument into the present day. And one of the things that I was struck by was this whole inquiry around the role of Afghan interpreters and those people who have been at the centre of these questions around their kind of support to the British forces in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And the Iraq war, full of South Asian caterers, people doing the laundry, huge support services from Nepal and India. I mean, Nepal actually banned its own citizens from going there eventually because some of them were getting killed. So this is a story, it has a different incarnation in the modern era, but it's definitely a story where we can draw the lineage of the contemporary reliance during war on these people from around the world, Philippines as well, sends lots and lots of people into Middle East. So I think there is definitely a trajectory there that this is the sort of historical beginnings of, perhaps. What was the other question? Oh, the pay. Yeah, they were paid. So they were paid. Indian soldiers were always paid by the British Indian state, by the Indian Exchequer, and that cost. So it's the Indian taxpayer was paying for these soldiers, but any extra costs for going overseas, so the shipping, extra, they got kind of extra allowance for going abroad, anything like that was paid for by Britain. But the basic pay of these soldiers until the Second World War, and that's why Churchill gets so angry and upset about India, because he sees it as doing a good deal, saying that Britain will pay the cost of the Indian Army in the Second World War.
Great, thank you. There was a question at the back. Who? Right at the back.
Thank you again for this presentation. It was lovely. I wanted to ask you, I guess, a question around the clashes between maybe imperial identity and a national identity in the British Army. I'm from Malta, and my great-grandfather served in the British Army. My grandma always tells me how when he served in the army, he was a captain. He was well, on his side, he said, well, there's a British imperial identity to why he was in the army. But at the end of the Second World War, he lost his position. He was decommissioned from his role, even though he wanted to continue in the army. But he never took it really against the British Empire, which at the end I found obviously quite, interesting that he just accepted that scenario. So I guess with the soldiers that you're witnessing, how many different case studies do you see with these soldiers? How do they see themselves in the empire? Is there a maritime connection to their identity, or are they completely separate to it? Thank you.
Thank you. So just to sum up again for people listening online, it's a great question about the relationship between imperial identities, national identities, military and maritime identities. Have you been able to kind of untangle any of those from the archive?
It's a great question, and I'm conscious when I'm talking about this that I'm using terminology like British and Indian, and it's you're using a shorthand for all kinds of much more complex identities where people might not have ascribed themselves to those at all. I think the way I see it is that there was a more capacious idea of Britishness, for sure, in the 19th and 20th centuries. But again, it's really hard to know, because how do you tell from the sources? People are often making claims, for instance, for pensions, or they're formulating their identity in certain ways. One thing that I've always thought was really interesting is the difference between, if you do interviews with South Asian people in India who served in the Second World War, who've grown up against the background of nationalism in India, their idea of their allegiance at that time to the crown is very different to British South Asians who are here, because they've grown up in a very different, or sort of have lived in a very different context around nationalism.
Even the Maltese there were a lot of Maltese who were supportive of Mussolini rather than having been part of the British Empire. So, and I have another member of my family went on that side. So it's a very divided, it was even a divided community.
I think it's, essentially, I guess it's about just trying to think about the making of sort of Britishness and what we call British army, say, perhaps just thinking about how that actually all comes about. But I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm afraid we have to wrap up the questions there, but before we do, I'd like us to thank Yasmin.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, for a really excellent, really, really interesting lecture. So before I let you go, if you've enjoyed that, I want to give you a brief note on forthcoming Royal Historical Society events this autumn. So our next London-based lecture takes place on Tuesday, the 4th of November, when we host the Society's annual public history lecture with Gresham College, London, which is down in Holborn. And this year's speaker is a journalist and historian, Daniel Finkelstein, whose lecture is entitled Minor Criminal, The Trial of the Man Who Murdered My Grandmother. So anyone who's read his book will be wanting to come to this, I imagine, and booking for that event will open shortly. Do keep an eye on our website for for that. Away from London, next week, the Society is visiting historians at the University of Aberdeen. So particularly for anybody who's listening online who is in the northeast of Scotland, we will be there Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday next week. You are very, very welcome to come along. Our visit is going to be accompanied by a public lecture at the university on Wednesday the 17th of September with Professor Matthew J. Smith of UCL, who'll be speaking on slavery, big data, and the cultures of Caribbean ancestral histories. Then, on Wednesday the 17th of October, the Society will be at the University of Suffolk in Ipswich for a public lecture by Professor Tim Grady of the University of Chester, who'll be speaking on Unveiling the Tapestry of Death, Britain and the Memory of the Two World Wars. So full detail and booking for these events, as well as recordings of many previous lectures, workshops and panels, are of course available from the Society's website. Thank you all very much for coming, for listening, for your universally excellent questions, and we hope to see you at a future event. Thank you.